Turn off that pool. You're wasting precious water. Karen, it rained yesterday. Don't argue with me or I'll call the city. So yeah, that's how my Saturday morning cannonball turned into a courtroom drama before I'd even had coffee. Smash that like button if you've ever had a neighbor invent rules on the spot, and subscribe if you enjoy stories where karma shows up with a fire hose. Grab your snacks, because you're about to hear how one HOA Karen drained my entire pool, and how I turned her basement into an indoor swimming lesson courtesy of a city fire hydrant. Picture this, the first warm weekend of the year, the kind that makes you forget every miserable winter morning you ever scraped ice off a windshield. The sun was hanging just right, golden light stretching across my backyard, the water in my pool shimmering like it had been waiting all year to finally show off. I had spent the past week skimming leaves, balancing chemicals, and hauling bags of shock treatment like some backyard scientist preparing for launch day. When I finally peeled the cover back and saw that clear, blue surface, it felt like I had unlocked a little slice of summer heaven. By Saturday morning, I was ready to enjoy the payoff. I pulled out the deck chairs, set the Bluetooth speaker low with some music, and slid into the water with that perfect combination of relief and pride that only comes after work you didn't want to do, but did anyway. The neighborhood was alive too. Kids on bikes weaving down the street, someone mowing a lawn 2 houses over, the smell of burgers already drifting from someone's grill. It was the kind of suburban soundtrack you don't appreciate until you realize how rare peace and normalcy really are. I leaned back on my float, a cold drink balanced in the cup holder, and just listened. My plan was simple. No chores, no errands, no interruptions. Just me, the sun, and a pool that finally felt worth every drop of sweat and every dollar spent keeping it running. For 5 minutes, it was exactly that. 5 minutes of silence punctuated only by the water lapping against the sides of the pool, the faint hum of a bee drifting by, and the occasional splash when I lazily kicked my feet. 5 minutes where I convinced myself this summer would be different, that I could actually carve out time to relax instead of chasing down to-do lists or fixing whatever broke next around the house. What I didn't realize in those 5 minutes of bliss was that someone else was watching. Someone who had been waiting for the first sign of fun to stomp it out. Clipboard probably already tucked under her arm. The very existence of my pool wasn't just an annoyance to her, it was, in her mind, a direct violation of neighborhood order. While I floated with my eyes closed, convincing myself I had found serenity, the opening shot of a neighborhood war was already loading right over the fence. 5 minutes of peace was all I got before the chaos arrived. Just as the warmth of the sun had started to soak into my skin and lull me into a rare state of calm, the sharpest sound shattered the moment. It wasn't a car alarm or a barking dog, but the unmistakable voice of my neighbor cutting across the fence like a buzzsaw. My eyes opened to see her silhouette rising from the other side, arms folded tight, jaw locked, eyes narrowed into 2 slits of pure judgment. The sound carried with such force that it startled a bird from the maple tree and made me sit up straighter on my float. She had not even stepped fully into view before her voice came again, rising higher as if volume alone could grant her authority. Karen had perfected the art of appearing larger than life without actually doing much. She gripped the top of the fence with white knuckles, leaning forward just enough to look like a guard stationed at a border crossing. Her robe was cinched unevenly, hair pinned up in a way that suggested she had been rehearsing this performance rather than simply stepping outside by chance. Her eyes flicked from the pool to my drink and back again, each glance layered with the kind of contempt reserved for people who commit real crimes. What made it even stranger was the silence of everything else around us. The lawnmower 2 houses over had cut off. The chatter of children riding by had faded. It was as though the entire street paused to listen, waiting for whatever came next from the neighborhood's self-appointed sheriff. She didn't just yell. She projected with the energy of someone delivering a closing argument in a courtroom. Every word was sharp and punctuated. Every accusation carried as though she believed the trees themselves needed to be convinced of my wrongdoing. I stayed in the pool, water dripping off my shoulders, caught between confusion and irritation. It wasn't the first time she had poked her head over the fence, but the intensity in her voice made this different. She wasn't just complaining about noise or leaves drifting onto her property. This was something heavier, fueled by some grievance she had been saving for just the right moment. As she leaned further, her shadow stretched across the water, merging with my reflection and breaking the calm I had enjoyed only minutes earlier. What had begun as a simple Saturday swim had already transformed into a confrontation I hadn't asked for, and judging by the fire in her expression, it was only the beginning. Her first words came out like a gavel striking wood, ringing through the air with the kind of certainty only someone truly unreasonable can muster. She accused me of draining the city reservoir, as if my modest pool had somehow tapped into the municipal system like a secret underground pipeline. The phrase she used was environmental crime scene, which might have been funny if it hadn't been yelled with such conviction. According to her, every gallon of water sparkling in the sunlight behind me was stolen from the mouths of thirsty children and parched lawns across the county. I tried to answer calmly, pointing out that it had rained the day before and that I hadn't even added more than a few inches since opening the pool. She waved her hand in dismissal, like facts were irrelevant, as if the water itself was evidence of my guilt. The way she carried herself reminded me of those late-night documentaries where an investigator insists on a conspiracy, even when the evidence points in another direction. Her eyes never left the surface of the pool, glaring at the ripples as though each small wave proved her case. The neighbors had begun to notice. Curtains shifted in nearby windows, a door creaked open across the street, and the stillness of the block gave way to curiosity. To them, it probably looked like a simple argument, but I could feel the weight of her words pressing into me. This wasn't just about water. This was about control. She wanted the world to stop spinning until it aligned with her version of order. And in that order, my pool was a symbol of wasteful rebellion. Her accusations escalated quickly. She spoke about property values, about climate change, about how my pool set a dangerous precedent for the neighborhood. At one point, she even suggested I was endangering wildlife, because birds might mistake the chlorine for a natural pond. Each statement piled on top of the last until it became less of a complaint and more of a sermon delivered over the fence line. Standing waist-deep in the water, I realized this was not a casual clash between neighbors. This was a declaration of war, dressed up as environmental activism, and judging by the fire in her voice, she wasn't about to stop at words. She had decided my pool was the hill she would fight on, and she was prepared to drag the entire neighborhood into the battle. Her opening claim was so absurd I almost laughed, but the way she delivered it left no room for humor. She declared that my pool was single-handedly responsible for draining the city's reserves, like I had rigged a pipeline from the reservoir straight into my backyard. She called it an environmental crime scene, her words echoing down the street with the confidence of a judge handing out a sentence. To hear her tell it, I was the villain in some water theft saga, stealing from the thirsty and careless with every splash. I tried to reason with her. I mentioned that it had rained the day before and that I had barely topped off the pool since uncovering it for the season. She wasn't interested. She waved her hand like swatting at a fly, dismissing any explanation before it had the chance to land. Her eyes stayed fixed on the pool, narrowing with suspicion at every ripple, as if the movement of the water itself was an admission of guilt. By then, people were starting to notice. A curtain twitched across the street, a neighbor's door opened just enough for a face to peek through, and the entire block seemed to hold its breath. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded like a simple neighborly dispute, but I could feel something sharper beneath her accusations. This wasn't about water usage. This was about control. She wanted everyone watching to see her as the defender of order, the guardian of community values, and she had chosen my pool as the enemy. The accusations multiplied as she worked herself into a rhythm. She insisted I was lowering property values, destroying the climate, and setting a dangerous precedent for other residents who might follow my reckless example. At one point, she even argued that the chlorine endangered birds who could mistake my backyard oasis for a natural pond. Every claim was delivered with the dramatic flourish of someone who believed their personal opinion carried the weight of law. Standing waist-deep in the water, I realized this was no ordinary squabble. It was the beginning of something bigger, a campaign fueled, not by logic, but by her determination to bend the neighborhood to her will. My pool was no longer just a pool. In her eyes, it had become a battlefield. The next morning, I stepped outside to collect the mail and froze at the sight of a paper fluttering against my box. It was taped in place with more care than a school project, the edges perfectly aligned, the surface stamped with what looked like an official seal. At first glance, it carried the weight of something important, but when I leaned closer, the truth revealed itself. The bold letters across the top read, "Neighborhood water waste, fine, $500, and the seal, once admired from a distance, was nothing more than a pixelated design that could have been lifted from a free clip art library. The document was written in a strange mix of legal jargon and half-formed sentences, as though someone had mashed together phrases from a court show transcript. It cited imaginary codes and bylaws, numbers that did not exist in any municipal record. According to this new authority, I had committed reckless environmental abuse by maintaining a recreational aquatic hazard. I stood there in disbelief, holding the paper in one hand, my coffee in the other, wondering if this was some sort of elaborate prank. But then I noticed the handwriting at the bottom, scrawled in blue ink, clearly hers. Failure to pay will result in escalating consequences. The signature was underlined twice, followed by a flourish that looked like she had practiced it in front of a mirror. It wasn't just an empty threat typed on a screen. This was her declaration of jurisdiction, a line drawn in ballpoint ink. As I read the notice again, laughter bubbled up despite myself. The language was so theatrical that it felt like something out of a low-budget drama, yet the more I thought about it, the less amusing it became. She had gone to the effort of creating this and displaying it publicly. Neighbors walking their dogs could read it, delivery drivers could see it, and anyone passing by might assume I really was under investigation. It wasn't just harassment, it was an attempt to humiliate me in plain sight. I carried the notice inside, laid it on the kitchen table, and stared at it as though it might explain itself. Somewhere next door, I could hear the faint click of her camera shutter, documenting what she believed was another piece of evidence in her crusade. In her world, she wasn't just a neighbor. She was the judge, the jury, and apparently the clerk of her own imaginary court. The morning after the notice appeared, I stepped into the backyard, ready to skim a few leaves and maybe reclaim some sense of normalcy. At first glance, everything seemed fine. The sun glinted off the water, birds chirped, and for a fleeting moment I thought maybe the storm had passed. Then I walked closer and realized something was terribly wrong. The waterline had dropped so far overnight that half the tiles were exposed. My once sparkling pool looked tired and shallow, the surface rippling against steps that should have been covered. I crouched beside the drain and found the culprit. The valve was twisted open, still dripping as though mocking me. It hadn't been an accident, not some faulty seal or mechanical failure. Someone had deliberately released the water. The cement around the drain was damp, and faint footprints trailed off toward the fence. My stomach sank as the obvious truth settled in. Karen had crossed from yelling over the fence to sneaking onto my property under the cover of darkness. The sound of laughter carried faintly from her yard, sharp and triumphant, like she already knew what I had discovered. I stood there, staring at the emptying basin, fury simmering beneath the disbelief. Pools don't drain themselves overnight, and the only person who had spent the past week screaming about water waste was conveniently next door. I thought about the work it had taken to open that pool, hours spent scrubbing, balancing chemicals, and hauling supplies, only to watch weeks of effort vanish down a drain because she decided my relaxation offended her. The water that had shimmered in the sunlight yesterday now trickled through cracks in the concrete and into the thirsty soil below. What unsettled me more than the mess was the thought of her creeping through my yard while I slept. The idea of her quietly plotting, twisting valves, and slipping back over the fence painted a picture that was far more invasive than any shouted insult. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about sabotage. I stood at the edge of the pool, fists clenched, and realized that the battle I had hoped to avoid had officially begun. She had made her move in the dead of night, and I was left staring at the proof, half a pool of water gone, and a neighbor who clearly wasn't finished. I knew I needed proof. Accusations alone would only feed her narrative, and without evidence it would turn into my word against hers. That night, I checked the feed from the cameras I had installed earlier in the spring, more out of habit than expectation. At first, the footage was uneventful. A stray cat darted across the yard, a car passed slowly down the street, nothing unusual. Then the timestamp hit 2 a.m, and the figure I dreaded appeared on the screen. She moved with surprising confidence, as though she had rehearsed the route. Dressed in an oversized hoodie and wearing a pair of garden gloves, she walked straight to the pool's edge without hesitation. The glare from the security light caught the rubber soles of her Crocs, leaving no doubt about her identity. She crouched, tugged at the drain valve, and twisted until water began to rush out. The camera microphone picked up the faint hiss of the release, a sound that made my stomach knot as I watched. What struck me most wasn't the act itself, but the look on her face. The night vision turned everything into shades of green and gray, but even through the grainy footage, I could see the satisfaction etched across her features. She wasn't sneaking in with guilt or hesitation. She was enjoying it. She stood there for a moment, hands on her hips, watching the water spiral away like she was the conductor of some petty symphony. Afterward, she scanned the yard with the vigilance of a spy, pausing near the fence to check for any sign of witnesses. The absurdity of it hit me then. This wasn't a prank or a lapse in judgment. It was deliberate sabotage carried out with the seriousness of a mission. She slipped back over the fence, the camera catching the awkward scramble as her slippered foot snagged briefly on the top before she vanished into the shadows. I replayed the footage 3 times, each viewing stoking the fire of disbelief into anger. There it was, undeniable proof that she had trespassed and vandalized my property. For the first time since her crusade began, I felt the tide shift. She had crossed a line, and now I had the evidence to show everyone exactly who she really was. By noon the next day, she had escalated from midnight trespasser to full-scale public prosecutor. I watched from my porch as Karen marched from house to house, clutching a folder so stuffed with papers it looked ready to burst. Every knock on a door was followed by her dramatic pause, the kind that suggested she was delivering life or death news. When neighbors opened up, she launched into the same speech, voice sharp enough to carry down the block. According to her, I had been illegally hoarding water in my backyard, creating what she called a toxic swamp that endangered property values. I could see the disbelief on some of their faces, but others looked uneasy, swayed by her confidence and the sheer volume of her performance. She flipped through printed photographs like an attorney showing exhibits to a jury, pointing at shots of my pool as if they were evidence of criminal activity. The images were clearly taken with her telephoto lens, angles only possible if she had been lurking with that camera pressed against her fence. By the time she reached the 4th house, she was gesturing wildly, mimicking the motion of someone opening a valve and releasing gallons of water. She described my pool as a breeding ground for disease and claimed I was putting the entire neighborhood at risk. The words dripped with a kind of theatrical authority, as though she expected her audience to gasp and rally behind her. From across the street, I noticed curtains twitching. Some neighbors stepped outside, pulled more by curiosity than conviction. She had gathered a small crowd now, feeding off their attention. I stood quietly, leaning on the porch railing, resisting the urge to shout back. It was like watching a street performance where the act only grew louder the longer it went on. Her final flourish came when she announced she had already contacted city officials, insisting that an investigation was underway. The truth was, the inspector had already cleared me, but she conveniently left that part out. When she finally marched back toward her own yard, the folder clutched to her chest like a trophy, I realized her campaign wasn't about facts at all. It was about spectacle. She didn't need the truth. She just needed enough noise to convince people that her version of reality was the one that mattered. 2 days later, a white city truck rolled slowly down the street and stopped in front of my house. The man who stepped out wore a reflective vest and carried a clipboard, the kind of official presence that immediately made neighbors peek through blinds. I knew right away who had summoned him. Karen was already outside before he had even closed his truck door, waving her arms like she was guiding in a plane. She hurried across her lawn, folder in hand, ready to present her case. The inspector introduced himself politely and explained that he was responding to a complaint about water misuse. His tone suggested this was not the first time he had been dragged into neighborhood theatrics. I invited him into the backyard, pointing out the pool that by then was only half full thanks to her sabotage. He studied it for a moment, asked about my maintenance routine, and requested to see my most recent water bill. I had been preparing for this, knowing she would eventually push matters past the point of yelling. I handed him the neatly folded statement I had pulled from my files. He scanned the numbers, then gave me a look that blended exasperation with relief. My usage was well within the limits, even below average for the month thanks to rainfall. I could see him mentally checking the box that cleared me of any wrongdoing. Karen, however, was not ready to accept reality. She launched into a tirade about invisible hoses, underground taps, and secret methods I was supposedly using to funnel water into my property. The inspector paused, glanced at me, and then at her, before sighing in a way that carried years of bureaucratic fatigue. When he finally spoke, it was measured and firm. He explained to Karen that there were no violations, no misuse, and certainly no evidence of the dramatic claims she had made. He even pointed to the bill again, circling the conservation credit I had received for staying under the recommended threshold. Karen's face tightened, her lips pressed thin, and for the first time her voice faltered. The inspector handed my documents back and gave a small nod that felt like an acknowledgement of the circus I had been forced to endure. As he climbed into his truck, Karen remained planted on her lawn, fists clenched at her sides. For me, the visit was confirmation that I had nothing to hide. For her, it was just another battle lost in the war she had declared. After the inspector left, I walked the yard with a new kind of focus. His visit had cleared me, but it also confirmed that Karen would not stop. As I circled near the fence, something caught my eye. A thick green hose, barely visible beneath a pile of decorative stones, ran under the wooden boards and disappeared into her property. At first I thought it might be an old irrigation line, but the faint hum coming from her side told a different story. I crouched lower, pressing my ear toward the boards, and the steady vibration confirmed it. She was running some kind of pump. I traced the hose back toward my pool and realized it wasn't connected to anything on my end. That meant she had tapped into the municipal supply herself, diverting water to feed her prized lawn and garden. The realization made my stomach twist. She had been shouting about conservation and accusing me of draining the city, while she herself was siphoning off water through a setup that was not only unauthorized, but almost certainly illegal. The irony of it struck me in waves. She had paraded through the neighborhood with her folder of accusations, yet hidden behind her carefully trimmed hedges was a system that explained why her grass always looked unnaturally green, even in the driest weeks. The perfect flower beds she flaunted during block parties suddenly made sense. She wasn't nurturing them through discipline or care. She was stealing resources to keep them alive. I snapped a few photos with my phone, careful to capture the hose crossing into her property and the small, fresh cut in the wood panel where she had widened a gap to pass it through. The evidence felt heavy in my hands. It wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was a pattern of hypocrisy and dishonesty that stretched further than shouting over fences. Back inside, I looked over the images again, each one more damning than the last. For days, she had accused me of crimes against the neighborhood, but the quiet drone of her hidden pump told the real story. The woman who preached about order and responsibility had been hiding the very secret that could undo everything she claimed to stand for. When the invitation slid under my door, I almost laughed. It was printed on heavy paper, as if she were hosting a gala. The words, "Emergency HOA Meeting," written in bold at the top. The location was listed as her garage, and the time was set for 7 o'clock that evening. I knew instantly it was less a meeting, and more a trial with me cast as the defendant. Curiosity won out over common sense, so I went. By the time I arrived, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a makeshift podium that looked suspiciously like her ironing board draped with a white sheet. On the walls, she had taped poster boards covered in photographs of my pool taken from every imaginable angle. Some were zoomed in so closely you could see the condensation on a glass I had left by the edge. Others were wide shots that captured my entire yard, like exhibits in a case file. She stood proudly at the front, shuffling her papers with the gravity of someone about to announce a national crisis. The neighbors trickled in, hesitant but curious. Some whispered to each other. Others avoided my gaze altogether, already convinced by the spectacle she had constructed. When the room filled, she cleared her throat and launched into her speech. Her voice carried with the certainty of a seasoned politician. She called my pool a reckless misuse of community resources and claimed it threatened property values across the block. She waved her arms toward the photographs as if they were irrefutable evidence. Every sentence grew more dramatic. According to her, my pool was not just wasteful but dangerous. She said it posed a risk of contamination, that it could spread disease, that it encouraged irresponsible behavior. Her slideshow, powered by an old projector balanced on a milk crate, displayed charts with numbers that had no sources and arrows that always pointed downward, as though the very act of my swimming caused the neighborhood to decline. I sat quietly in the back, watching the show unfold. Part of me was angry, but another part marveled at the sheer dedication she poured into this campaign. She had transformed her garage into a courtroom, herself into judge and jury, and my pool into the community's greatest threat. The absurdity was hard to ignore, yet the faces of my neighbors told me she had their attention. For the first time, I realized she might actually convince them. The so-called meeting moved quickly from accusations to what she called action. After her dramatic slideshow and a round of exaggerated gasps from the neighbors who were already under her spell, she announced that a vote was in order. She stood tall behind the ironing board podium, clipboard ready, eyes scanning the room like a general about to send her troops into battle. Her question was simple but loaded. Should the community allow pools at all, or should they be banned, for the sake of conservation and property value protection? There was no discussion of moderation or compromise. She did not mention regulations or water management. It was all or nothing, and she was pressing hard for nothing. A stack of papers was passed down the rows, each one a petition she had drafted calling for the removal of pools across the neighborhood. The language on the page was as dramatic as her speeches. It claimed that pools attracted pests, wasted valuable resources, and set a precedent for unchecked neighborhood decline. I watched as pens began to scratch across the top sheets. Some neighbors signed quickly, not even reading the text, simply eager to escape the tense atmosphere. Others hesitated, eyes darting between her stern expression and my quiet presence at the back of the garage. I could see uncertainty in a few faces, people who probably just wanted to mow their lawns and live their lives without getting dragged into suburban politics. But under her watchful gaze, hesitation turned into compliance. One by one, the names began to fill the lines. When the papers reached me, she didn't bother hiding her expectation. Her eyes locked on mine, daring me to participate in my own condemnation. I slid the papers to the next person without touching a pen, and the flicker of irritation that crossed her face told me she had been hoping for the performance of me, refusing in front of everyone. By the end of the night, she stood holding a petition with a dozen signatures. It wasn't the whole neighborhood, but it was enough for her to feel victorious. She raised it in the air like a trophy, declaring that the community had spoken. The neighbors shuffled out in silence, some looking guilty, others relieved. I sat there a moment longer, watching her bask in her hollow triumph, already planning how to turn her false sense of victory into the beginning of her downfall. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the petition still fresh in my mind. Her triumphant expression lingered like a stain, and I knew if I wanted to push back, I needed more than indignation. I opened my laptop and began digging through county records, the kind of late-night research that feels tedious until you stumble on something that changes everything. Property maps, inspection notes, and permit histories slowly filled my screen. At first, nothing stood out. Her house was well maintained on paper, every record neat and filed, but then I noticed a cluster of documents marked incomplete. I clicked deeper and found references to irrigation permits that had never been finalized. One entry in particular mentioned unauthorized connections flagged during a routine check years ago. It looked like the case had been closed without resolution, a bureaucratic thread left dangling. Cross-referencing with more recent satellite images confirmed what I had already suspected after discovering the hose by the fence. She had been rerouting water onto her property, tapping into lines she had no right to use. The realization brought a surge of grim satisfaction. Here was a woman who had paraded around with folders of accusations and fine notices, accusing me of crimes against the environment, while her own record showed clear violations. It explained the perpetual perfection of her lawn, the way her garden thrived even during dry spells. She had been hiding in plain sight, breaking rules while accusing everyone else of doing the same. I printed copies of the records and spread them across the table. Each page felt like a piece of armor, proof that her authority was built on a foundation of hypocrisy. I imagined her face when confronted with documents stamped by the very county offices she pretended to represent. The thought alone steadied me. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Her house stood in darkness, blinds drawn tight, but I could almost feel her presence on the other side, already scheming her next move. For the first time since this feud began, I wasn't just reacting. I was building a case of my own, one grounded in facts rather than theatrics. She wanted a war over water, and I had just found the weapon that could turn the tide. Walking past her property a few evenings later, I caught a sound that made me pause. It was low at first, a kind of steady hum that didn't belong to cicadas or passing cars. I stopped near the fence line and listened closer. The vibration grew clearer, mechanical and constant, like a pump laboring against water pressure. Curiosity pushed me to step a little closer, and as I leaned toward the slats, I caught the faint gurgle of water being forced through pipes. It was coming from her basement. A neighbor happened to be outside at the same time, dragging a trash can toward the curb. He slowed when he saw me listening, then lowered his voice. According to him, her basement had a reputation. Over the years, several people had whispered about flooding issues she tried to hide. Whenever heavy rain came, sump pumps worked overtime, and more than once he had noticed dehumidifiers running day and night. She never admitted to problems, but he was convinced her pristine home had been fighting water intrusion for years. The idea that the self-appointed enforcer of water rules had been quietly battling her own basement leaks felt too perfect to ignore. While she accused me of draining the city dry, her own foundation was apparently drowning. That explained the strange urgency in her crusade. She was not just obsessed with my pool. She was projecting her own fragile reality, terrified someone might notice her house was not the flawless model she pretended it to be. I walked home with the humming sound still in my ears, each mechanical pulse reminding me that her secret was closer to the surface than she realized. It made sense of her desperation, the way she escalated every complaint into a crisis. If the neighborhood discovered she had flooding issues, her reign as the guardian of standards would crumble. She could not afford for anyone to see her weakness, so she pointed fingers elsewhere. That night I stared at the records I had uncovered, pairing them in my mind with the rumor of her basement problem. The story was starting to write itself. She had been shouting about conservation while hiding a hidden reservoir beneath her own floorboards. The irony was building, and I knew sooner or later the truth would break through her walls just as surely as the water did. The idea came to me in the most ordinary way, over a cup of coffee with a friend who worked for the city. He was talking about the schedule for hydrant flushing, something they did every spring to clear the lines and test water pressure. Most people never thought twice about it, but as he described the process, my mind wandered to the sight of torrents of water gushing freely into the streets. He explained how crews hooked up hoses, how the streams were directed into drains, and how sometimes whole blocks would be soaked before the work was done. I sat back, pretending to listen, while the pieces began to connect in my head. Karen had drained my pool, sabotaged my peace, and built her reputation on the illusion of authority. All her accusations were wrapped around the theme of water waste. The thought of using the city's own maintenance routine as the stage for her downfall felt almost poetic. It would not require sneaking around in the dark or lowering myself to her level. All it needed was a little planning and the right timing. I asked my friend how far in advance the schedule was set, keeping my tone casual. He didn't think much of it, flipping through his clipboard to show me the map. As luck would have it, one of the hydrants due for flushing sat just 2 houses down from mine. My driveway offered the perfect spot for equipment, a straight line for the hoses, and plenty of room to work. I could hardly believe how neatly the opportunity presented itself. Later that night, the plan solidified in my mind. I would request that the crew set up on my side, a simple favor that would not raise suspicion. The water had to go somewhere, and with a few adjustments, I could make sure it found its way across her property. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just a redirection of a process already scheduled to happen. As I imagined her reaction, the image was almost too sweet. She had turned my backyard into a battlefield, and now the city itself would provide the flood that exposed her hypocrisy. It felt like fate, the kind of justice you couldn't invent if you tried. Once the idea had taken root, everything became about timing. I called the city office, explained that I lived near one of the hydrants scheduled for maintenance, and offered my driveway for the crew's use. The request was simple enough that no one questioned it. They were happy to have easy access and assured me the work would be done within the week. When I hung up the phone, a quiet satisfaction settled over me. This wasn't a prank. It was logistics aligning in my favor. The days leading up to the flush stretched long, each one filled with small reminders of why this plan mattered. I saw her measuring my yard with a tape line, snapping pictures from behind her blinds, and even leaving another notice stuffed into my mailbox. Each act of pettiness only confirmed that the confrontation was inevitable. The difference was that now I held the advantage, and she didn't even know it. I spent the evenings preparing in subtle ways. I cleared the edge of my driveway, moved tools and yard clutter out of the way, and even trimmed back a few branches to make sure the hydrant crew would have no obstacles. To anyone else, it looked like spring cleaning, but in my mind, it was setting the stage. I wanted everything seamless so that when the water came rushing out, there would be no question where it should flow. The night before, I stood in the backyard, staring at the faint glow of her windows. She was awake late, pacing in front of her curtains, still consumed by whatever narrative she had created about me. I almost laughed at the thought that while she was busy plotting her next accusation, the city was about to provide the very flood that would wash her performance away. By morning, I felt oddly calm. The crew would arrive soon, and all I had to do was step aside and let the process unfold. There was nothing sneaky about it, nothing I could be accused of manipulating. It was all official work, documented and scheduled. The only twist was that the water, once released, would follow the path I had made ready. Her yard, her basement, her carefully hidden weaknesses, all of it stood directly in line with what was coming. The morning of the flush arrived bright and still, the kind of day that seemed too ordinary to carry any weight. I sipped coffee on the porch while waiting for the city truck, pretending to be casual, though inside I could feel the anticipation building. It didn't take long for her to appear. She stepped outside in her robe, clutching a pair of binoculars as if she were a wildlife researcher documenting some rare animal. Her gaze never left my property, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. She lingered at the fence, shifting from one foot to the other, clearly suspicious. When the truck finally turned the corner, her head snapped toward it like a hawk spotting prey. She hurried to the end of her driveway, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other already pointing in my direction. I could almost hear her thoughts, convinced this was some clandestine project of mine, a new scheme to waste water in front of the entire neighborhood. The crew climbed out, hauling hoses and tools, entirely unaware of the drama simmering between the two yards. She called out questions immediately, her voice rising with each one. Why here? Why today? Was this connected to my pool? The workers, seasoned from years of dealing with curious residents, offered polite non-answers, assuring her it was just routine maintenance. That explanation did nothing to calm her. If anything, it fueled her suspicion. She began pacing back and forth, muttering about conspiracies and connections, as if she alone could uncover the hidden meaning behind a municipal schedule. I leaned casually against the porch railing, doing my best to appear uninterested. Every so often I caught her glancing my way, searching for signs of guilt or confirmation. The more relaxed I looked, the more agitated she became. The binoculars went up again, trained on the workers as they uncoiled the thick hose and attached it to the hydrant. The sound of the wrench tightening echoed across the street, and I watched her shoulders stiffen as though bracing for impact. In that moment, it struck me how much power she thought she held, and how quickly it was about to crumble. She believed she was catching me in the act, documenting another violation. What she didn't realize was that the real show was only seconds from beginning, and every ounce of her suspicion would soon turn into a flood she could not control. The wrench gave one final turn, and then the hydrant roared to life. A rush of water burst out with the force of a jet, spraying into the street before settling into a steady torrent that shimmered in the sunlight. The crew directed the hose toward the drainage system, but I had already positioned my own extension pipe, neatly secured to guide the flow. To anyone else, it looked like routine work, nothing unusual, just city maintenance doing its job. To me, it was the culmination of every insult, every notice, every sleepless night she had caused. The stream hit the pavement with such power that it raced along the curb, gathering speed as it moved. I watched the water snake its way down the slope, exactly as I had envisioned. Within moments, it reached the edge of her yard, pooling against the slight dip near her driveway. She stood frozen at the sight, her robe flapping around her ankles, eyes wide in disbelief. She had come outside expecting to witness my downfall, and instead, she was watching a wave march directly toward her property. At first, she tried to block it with words. She shouted at the workers, demanding they turn it off, insisting they were flooding the street illegally. They ignored her, focused on their gauges and flow meters, calm and professional. Her voice grew shrill, cracking as the water spread across her lawn and began to creep toward her foundation. She darted inside for a moment, then re-emerged with a broom, swiping at the current as if sheer effort could redirect it. The sight would have been comical if not for the fury twisting her features. The neighborhood gathered quickly. People stepped onto porches, some laughing quietly, others recording on their phones. Everyone could see what was happening. The woman who had spent weeks lecturing about conservation was now battling an unstoppable river at the edge of her own home. She splashed through puddles, hair coming loose, slippers dark with water. The broom clattered uselessly against the stream, each sweep pushing more water back toward her steps. I stayed silent, arms crossed, watching as the torrent poured exactly where it needed to go. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't revenge carried out in secret. It was a simple truth of gravity and planning. The hydrant water had found its path, and that path led straight to the one person who had tried to drown me in paperwork and lies. The sound of rushing water outside her house soon gave way to something deeper, a low gurgle that carried through the street. Her drains could not keep up. From my porch, I could see the dark line spreading across her driveway, water finding every crack and seam, seeping downward with steady determination. She ran inside, slamming the door behind her, and for a few moments the house looked calm. Then came the banging. It was the unmistakable noise of someone scrambling around a basement, shifting boxes and shouting in frustration. The door burst open again, and she staggered out, arms full of half-soaked decorations. Plastic bins clattered onto the grass, lids sliding away as waterlogged cardboard sagged under the weight. A string of holiday lights trailed behind her like a tail, dripping across the lawn. Her expression was wild, hair plastered to her forehead, slippers squishing with every step. It was the first time I had ever seen her lose composure completely. She was no longer the commanding voice of neighborhood rules, but a frantic homeowner trying to salvage a collapsing basement. The hydrant continued its roar, the stream relentless. Water poured into the slope of her yard and disappeared into the foundation with a quiet inevitability. Neighbors were gathering now, lining the sidewalks with a mix of sympathy and amusement. Phones were out, capturing every frantic dash as she tried to rescue belongings from the rising tide. Someone whispered that they had never seen her so vulnerable, and laughter rippled through the small crowd. I stayed where I was, leaning against the railing, watching as she dragged another load of soggy boxes to the curb. Her voice cracked as she shouted at the workers, blaming them, blaming me, blaming anyone within earshot. They simply shrugged, checking their gauges, reminding her it was standard city maintenance. There was nothing to argue with. The hydrant had been scheduled weeks ago, and no one could shut it down early. By the time she dropped a box of photo albums onto the grass, the damage was beyond denial. Pages stuck together, ink bled across covers, and the smell of damp paper carried into the warm air. Her basement had become the very pool she had accused me of wasting water on. And no matter how many words she threw into the air, the truth was soaking through the foundation of her home, undeniable and irreversible. She finally stumbled back outside, dripping from head to toe, her robe clinging and her hair hanging in strands across her face. The broom had been abandoned, and in its place she now waved her fists at the sky as though the entire universe had conspired against her. Her voice cracked with the effort, each shout carrying across the neighborhood like a siren. She called it an attack, claimed her property was under siege, and insisted someone had orchestrated this disaster to ruin her life. To anyone watching, it was clear she believed every word. The scene was chaos. Boxes floated in her driveway, ornaments rolled into the gutter, and the sound of water gushing into her basement echoed faintly each time she opened the door. She tried dragging a soggy rug into the street, only for it to collapse in her arms, heavy and dripping, spreading dirty water across the curb. Her slippers squelched with every step, leaving prints on the pavement like some trail of defeat. She shouted at me directly then, pointing across the street with such force her arm shook. She accused me of masterminding the whole event, of bribing the city workers, of using my pool as leverage to flood her home. Her accusations were so far removed from reality that a few neighbors actually chuckled. Others simply shook their heads, muttering about karma finally catching up to her. Her voice grew shrill as she begged the workers to shut it off, but they only reminded her that hydrant flushing was routine and temporary. They had paperwork, schedules, and supervisors confirming everything was by the book. She was powerless against a process that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with municipal maintenance. By the time she collapsed onto her front step, drenched and panting, the crowd around us had grown. Phones captured every detail, every frantic dash, every wild accusation. Her meltdown was no longer a private tantrum, but a public performance for the entire block. Watching her sink into despair, surrounded by the very neighbors she had tormented, I realized the tide had fully turned. The woman who had declared war over water had drowned herself in her own fury, and the neighborhood had witnessed every moment of her unraveling. The city worker handling the hydrant hardly flinched at her outburst. He adjusted his gloves, glanced at the roaring stream of water, and then at her, standing in the middle of her lawn, with slippers soaked and hair plastered against her cheeks. She shouted at him to shut it down, waving her arms as though her demands alone could twist the metal cap back into place. He stayed calm, clipboard in hand, and explained in a steady voice that everything was proceeding exactly as scheduled. The hydrant had to be flushed, and it had to run until the gauges showed clear pressure. Her face twisted in disbelief, as though she could not process a world where her words carried no authority. She tried again, this time pointing toward the curb where water pooled against the edge of her driveway. She insisted that the city was destroying her property, that the stream was targeting her specifically. The worker crouched, looked at the flow, and shrugged. He pointed out that her garden ornaments and the stone barrier she had installed were blocking the proper drainage path. The water, he said, was only doing what water always did. It was following the easiest route downhill. The explanation struck her like a slap. The garden gnomes she had so proudly displayed, the ones arranged in perfect formation along the drain, were now the very reason the torrent could not escape. She sputtered, searching for a response, but the truth sat there in plain sight. Her carefully staged lawn had become the obstacle, her design choices funneling the stream straight into her basement. The crowd of neighbors snickered quietly. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads, but the reaction was unanimous. For once, it was not me she could blame. The worker stood with professional detachment, wiping his hands on a rag, repeating that nothing could be done until the flush was complete. She slumped against her porch railing, the reality finally pressing down. It was not sabotage, it was not conspiracy, it was her own handiwork betraying her. The sight of her glaring at the gnomes, those little painted sentinels now half submerged, was almost too perfect. The very symbols of her control had become the instruments of her undoing. Of course, it was only a matter of time before the flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. She had called them, her voice carrying through the open windows just minutes earlier. When the patrol car rolled to a stop, she sprang into action, waving frantically as though she had just uncovered a national emergency. Her robe clung to her, her slippers sagged with water, yet she marched to the officers with all the authority she believed she had left. The story she told them was nothing short of theatrical. She claimed I had orchestrated an attack, that I had bribed the city workers to weaponize the hydrant against her home, that my pool was somehow linked to the flood pouring into her basement. Her voice cracked as she painted herself as a victim, pointing at me across the street, demanding they arrest me for sabotage. The officers listened in silence, their faces unreadable as she unloaded every detail of her version of events. When she finally paused for breath, they turned to the workers. Calmly and without hesitation, the crew explained that the flush had been scheduled weeks earlier, that it was routine, and that every action taken was documented and approved. They even produced paperwork confirming the maintenance order, complete with signatures and dates. One officer nodded, jotting notes, while the other glanced back at her lawn, where water still pooled around the gnomes and garden stones blocking the drain. He asked her if those decorations belonged to her. When she admitted they did, he pointed out that they were the reason the water had diverted toward her property in the first place. The words landed heavily, leaving her silent for the first time all day. The officers crossed the street to speak with me, and I simply handed over the water bill and the letter I had received about the hydrant schedule. They reviewed the documents, thanked me for my cooperation, and assured me I was not in violation of anything. Their calm professionalism stood in stark contrast to her flailing accusations. By the time they returned to her, the truth was impossible to ignore. She had called for backup, expecting a rescue. Instead, she received the confirmation that the flood was no crime at all, only the natural consequence of her own choices colliding with reality. As the patrol car idled and the city crew wrapped up their work, something unexpected happened. The neighbors who had been watching from their porches began to clap. It started with one person, a slow rhythm that echoed down the street, and then others joined in until the sound filled the block. The applause was not for me or even the hydrant workers. It was for the simple satisfaction of watching years of self-appointed authority collapse under its own weight. Karen stood frozen on her lawn, soaked and humiliated, as the people she had scolded for weeds, fences, and holiday decorations finally let out the laughter they had been holding back. Phones were out, capturing the moment from every angle. Someone whistled, another shouted, "Karma," and a few children darted into the puddles at the edge of her driveway, splashing with glee as though celebrating the downfall of a cartoon villain. I leaned against my porch railing, silent but smiling, watching the scene unfold. For once, I did not have to explain myself or defend against her accusations. The evidence of her behavior was spread across her yard in soggy boxes and drowned lawn ornaments. The water pooling around her foundation was a testament to her hypocrisy. No speech, no notice, no clipboard could spin this in her favor. She tried to rally, lifting her chin and waving her arms at the crowd, insisting she was the victim of sabotage. But her voice cracked, and each excuse was drowned out by laughter. The neighbors were done listening. They had heard enough over the years, and now they had seen the truth for themselves. Her authority, once propped up by intimidation and bluster, had evaporated as quickly as the afternoon sun dried the street. The workers shut off the hydrant, the torrent slowed, and silence settled again, broken only by the dripping from her robe. She stood surrounded by the wreckage of her own pride, unable to command the street as she once had. The applause faded into murmurs of relief, conversations about how long they had waited for this day. For the first time since moving in, I felt the weight of her presence lift. It was not just my victory, it was the neighborhood's. By the next morning, word had spread faster than the water that had filled her basement. Neighbors who hadn't witnessed the spectacle in person stopped me on my walk to ask if it was true. They wanted to know if her foundation had really taken on water, if the decorations on her lawn had floated away, if the city workers had stood by while her house turned into a shallow reservoir. Each retelling grew more colorful, but the core of the story remained the same. The self-proclaimed guardian of resources had been undone by her own arrogance. Rumors about the cleanup bill circulated almost immediately. One neighbor claimed she had called a restoration company before dawn, begging for an emergency crew to pump out the basement. Another said she had argued with her insurance provider for hours, trying to classify the event as a municipal fault. The reality, as I later confirmed, was simpler. The city denied any responsibility because their work had been routine and documented. The drain on her property had been blocked by her own landscaping choices, and the pump she had installed illegally only complicated matters. The costs were hers alone to bear. Estimates floated around, and the numbers were not kind. Thousands for water extraction, more for damaged flooring, and even more to replace boxes of belongings that had been soaked beyond saving. She had spent years brandishing threats of fines and penalties against others, but now the invoices piling on her kitchen table were addressed only to her. The sight of the restoration truck parked outside her house was enough to make the neighbors pause on their morning walks, shaking their heads with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. From my porch, I watched as crews hauled out soggy carpet, dripping insulation, and warped furniture. She hovered nearby, arms folded, barking orders that nobody seemed to take seriously. Her voice lacked its old power. The workers didn't flinch or rush. They simply kept at the job, focused on clearing the damage. Each trip from her basement was another. The reminder that her campaign had not only failed, but had backfired in the most literal way possible. The woman who had accused me of destroying the neighborhood was now the one battling the stench of mildew and the rising cost of repairs. Her pride had cracked just like her foundation, and for once, there was nothing she could fine or forbid to make the water disappear. By the following weekend, my pool was sparkling again, and Karen's yard smelled like mildew. By the following weekend, my pool was full again, the surface catching the sunlight in a way that made it look untouched by all the chaos of the week before. I floated on the water with a glass of lemonade resting beside me, the gentle sound of the filter humming a steady reassurance that life had returned to normal. Across the fence, her house told a different story. The smell of damp carpet lingered in the air, and a stack of ruined furniture sat piled at the curb, waiting for pickup. Each piece looked like a relic from a battle she had lost, warped wood and sagging upholstery testifying to the flood she could not stop. The neighborhood had shifted too. People who used to avoid her gaze now walked past her lawn without fear, exchanging smiles and small talk with me as though a weight had been lifted. Children rode their bikes along the street without her yelling about safety rules. Someone even joked about organizing a block party, a suggestion that would have been unthinkable only a few weeks earlier. The tension she carried with her had dissolved, replaced by something lighter, almost celebratory. I leaned back on my float and thought about how quickly things had changed. A few days earlier, I had been on the defensive, scrambling to prove I was not guilty of wasting water. She had seemed unstoppable, armed with her notices and her endless accusations. But water has a way of revealing the truth. It had poured into her basement, washing away the illusion of authority she had built for herself. In its wake, the neighborhood had seen her not as a protector but as the cause of her own downfall. She no longer looked over the fence with the same fire. When I caught glimpses of her outside, she moved quietly, shoulders hunched, as if hoping no one would notice. There were no more clipped warnings or accusations shouted across the yard. The silence was almost shocking, and it made the laughter of neighbors enjoying their freedom ring even louder. As I sipped my drink, I realized the sweetest part of the victory was not the water that had flooded her basement, but the calm that returned afterward. For the first time since I moved in, I could simply enjoy my pool without interruption, proof that sometimes karma doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it kicks open the hydrant and lets the flood speak for itself. And there you have it, the story of how Karen drained my pool and ended up with her own basement aquarium. If you're still watching, congrats, you survived the splash zone of suburban chaos. Hit that like button if you think water finds its own level. Subscribe if you enjoy stories where entitled neighbors get soaked by karma, and drop a comment about the wildest thing you've ever seen a neighbor do. Remember, you can't stop the tide of nonsense, but sometimes you can redirect it straight back where it belongs. Until next time, may your pool stay full and your neighbors stay dry.